This week I watched the 1950 film Sunset Blvd, and although I thought the movie was very interesting as a whole, there were moments where I was pretty bored and I felt like it was almost dragging on, and I was like, okay, I get it, time to move on. But like I said, as a whole, this movie was very interesting. It is film noir, and I think it is a perfect example of film noir. The way they used it in a single scene to make one person the enemy in 1 second, and then the next second, she's a starlit beauty. The lighting was just super impressive, and they have that dark, moody feeling throughout the film because of the lighting, and almost the entire film is a flashback, so it definitely fits in that category. To begin with, this is about a woman named Norma Desmond who was a silent film star, and she was beautiful and she did great, and then the talkie era came about and she lost her stardom. The way that she deals with the fact that she isn't a star anymore is by living in a fantasy world that she's set up in her own mansion, and her butler keeps that fantasy world going for her. Even though it takes a lot of work on his part, and he shouldn't do that for her, he does. Then this amateur writer comes along, and he is getting the best deal he possibly can. All he has to do is help this woman write a new script to take to DeMille for him to film. Then she gives him everything. She says she's gonna make it worth his while. She buys him all these fancy clothes, lets him ride in this really fancy car, and he gets everything he could possibly want without knowing what the true fatal ending is going to be. In the end, she does end up killing him because she doesn't want to be left, because stars are never left, so she shoots him. The film is left with her still living in her fantasy world, and she says, "Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up," which is some of the most famous lines in cinematic history. It kind of ends a little ambiguous, and you really get to decide what you think is gonna happen. As I had mentioned earlier, one of the greatest aspects of this film is its lighting. One of my favorite scenes from this movie, even though there were plenty of great scenes, one of my favorite scenes is when the first time her and Joe are going into her home movie theater to watch one of her films in the room full of pictures of her. And while they're in there, obviously the projector's coming in, showing on the screen and everything like that. And there's a moment where she says, "I will return to the screen and I will be famous," and she's holding her hand out. Well, the light coming from the projector at that angle is on her back. So it looks like she's triumphant, and she's got this darkness to her front, and she just looks crazy. Like she's making this wild comment about how she's gonna be famous again, and the next second she turns around and she faces the light, and she's got her hand up all beautifully and on her chin, and she looks like a beautiful star. I mean, just the way they were able to use that lighting in one scene to make her look evil at one point and then beautiful in the next, it really highlights the technical abilities of the team who made this movie and how they're able to use lighting, and the perfect example of how lighting, especially in a style or genre, depending on what you think, in film noir, to make these movies so dramatic and to make them what they are. Another big piece I noticed with the lighting, you can tell when Joe's outside of wherever Desmond is at. Like if he's outside of her house and he leaves and goes to the party, or if he's riding with Betty, or as long as he's not near Desmond, you can tell that the scenes are so much brighter and there's so much more light filling the rooms that he's in when she's not around. And then as soon as he goes back to her house or wherever she's at, it gets very dark and ominous again. There are scenes in her house where she's right next to a lamp, and so her face does look very lit up and it looks very bright, and he looks very bright, and the scene looks very bright. But altogether, her house and wherever she's at is very dark, and whenever he's not around her, it's very light. I obviously think they did that on purpose to convey how being around her just makes everything a little bit more dismal and a little bit more dark, and it just adds to that dramatic effect that she's dramatic and she's crazy. And then when he's not with her, obviously it's bright and it's day and it's nice when she's not around. Do you want to talk about the acting? Because you can tell these actors were so dedicated to the roles they had in this film, especially Desmond. The way that she portrays her character, who is a silent film star, and she even mentions one of her lines in this film, which is a very famous line, is something along the lines of, "We didn't need to talk, we had faces." And you can tell that she even sticks to this motto now in her daily life, the way she just normally goes about her day. Because throughout this entire film, she's so dedicated to using her facial expressions whether they're extremely outlandish and make you a bit uncomfortable, it only adds to the dramatic effect. She just uses her facial expressions so perfectly throughout this whole film that she really stays in character perfectly and reminds you that that's what this is about. She was a star and now she's not, and she's still living in the old days. Acting wise, I don't feel like anyone did a bad job. I felt like it was all great. I don't really have anything specific to say because, like I said, I just feel like they did a great job. I didn't see anything negative, but I just feel like Desmond, her character was so well done and so well portrayed that it definitely needed to be mentioned. I feel like I almost say the same thing every time in these finishing few sentences, but I really didn't have anything bad to say about this movie. I thought it was really good, and I did a little bit of research on it, and it is one of, and continues to be, one of the best films, and it seems to always be on the 100 movies people must watch list. So I feel like I definitely don't have the room to critique it in any way, but even if I did, I don't have anything bad to say. I really enjoyed this film. I thought it was great. I think the acting is great. The way that they used all these technical ways to film it was great. I think it definitely describes film noir. I think this movie is probably as close as you're gonna get to a perfect definition of film noir. So yeah, thank you for watching. Not that this matters at all, but Joe continuously mentions about the fact that he's gonna have to go back to Dayton, Ohio to get his job, and I just wanna say, I'm from Dayton, Ohio, so that was pretty cool to hear in a movie.